Our next speaker, Christopher Noessel, will be discussing gendered AI and his observations from the representation of AI in pop culture. He will present a report looking at 327 AI characters in pop culture. So, let's give a warm welcome to Christopher as he shares his valuable insights on gendered AI and the representation of AI in pop culture.
Hi, my name is Christopher Noessel, and I'm going to use my 9 minutes of this women's conference in order to talk to you a little bit about gender and AI in sci-fi. This conversation and the study that it resulted from began in 2018 when a colleague of mine, Chris Geisen, tagged me in a Twitter post citing Kathy Pearl's observation that embodied or expert AI are usually male, and disembodied or subservient AI are most often female. And then you can see that Chris name-checked me on this. And the reason he did so is twofold. He knew that in 2013, I had co-authored a book with Nathan Shedroff called Make It So, there it is, Make It So, which looked at interfaces in science fiction as if they were real world for lessons for us designers. I also kept right there a blog since that same time. And in the year prior to his tweet, I had done this big study looking at the stories that Hollywood tells us about AI and the ones especially that it doesn't tell us about AI that it ought to. So I had this really big database that I could draw on in order to do this analysis. Sadly, though, the existing database that I used for the Untold AI study really focused on shows and not on characters. So I went out and I found characters. I looked at IMDb, my own personal network, my own collection of analysis that I had done, found 325 AI characters. Everything from leading characters to supporting characters to devices, vehicles, you name it. Hopefully you'll recognize some of them that are up there on screen. Once I had these in the database, though, I was able to turn to that question about gender and subservience. But while I was in there, why not answer all sorts of questions about gender and AI that might pop up? And so that's what I did. In the time that I've got today, I don't have time to give you a full interpretation of the data. So I'm just going to try to sensitize you to it. But at the very end of the presentation, I'll give you a URL where you can read the full study, and that includes interpretations, including a guest post by Kathy Pearl. So once you begin to tag these attributes, you're able to look at the set for distributions. That's a really fancy word, but it just means like looking at one attribute. How does it break down as like a pie chart? So if we were to create a synthetic example that's far too simple for the real world, we had a collection of 325 humans. We could look at those humans and say, okay, what's their binary gender presentation? And we might come to 50-50. It's not going to be that, but that's an example. I mean, we might look at their eye color and go, oh, look, 33% are green, 33% are brown, 33% are blue. We would have an idea about the distributions. Here's one of those distributions from my real data. I tagged and the goodness of the AI, and it turns out that they're a pretty even split between goodness, evilness, and kind of neutrality or mixed. So that's an example of the distributions that I did as part of this study. And most of them were like interesting in and of themselves. But the infuriating one was when I took a look at sex. In this slide, we're going to look at it in a binary way, but in the following slide, it's going to be more complicated. In this slide, I simply am noting that when you take a look at a simplified version of female presenting and other presenting, and compare that to the male presenting, it's nearly a 2-to-1 ratio, and that is infuriating. There's no reason for it. But it gets kind of worse when we break it down into a more sophisticated categorization that befits what we see in sci-fi. Don't have time to get into this, but the main thing to realize or to hear is that when the AI show has biological sex characteristics for their characters, like a female presenting face or a female presenting body like we see in Westworld, there's nearly a parity of male to female characters. But when that gender is constructed socially, meaning only from names, meaning only from pronouns, meaning only from the voice presentations of the actor, there's nearly an 8-to-1 ratio. And this is when it matters the least. Because if it's only a socially constructed gender, why is it male? We'll come back to this later in the deck. So angry. All right. So the distributions were interesting and infuriating enough. I want to talk to you about correlations, but before I do it, I want to do a quick correlations 101, which is to say, we were looking at gender and subservience, but let's take it from a less political stance for this example and just say, okay, let's look at gender and eye color. If we were looking at that highly constructed data set that I had presented earlier, and there was a perfect distribution of gender to eye color, it would look something like this. When we look at women's eye color, you'd be like, oh, 33% of them have green eyes, 33% of them have brown eyes, 33% have blue eyes. And we would be like, oh, there's no correlation between these two attributes. But if instead we saw that women had all the blue eyes and men had all the brown eyes, you'd be going, wait, there's something causal going on and we ought to look at that. In the real world, data rarely looks that clean. This is much more like what you're going to find. And as you can see, the sort of arc diagram is hard to compare quite accurately. So instead, over the course of the study and in the later slides, I'm going to be using bar charts to represent the same information. Here you can see that blue is underrepresented in male and overrepresented in female. On the left, it's visual. On the right, though, you get some real numbers behind it. All right. So now we can take a look at the correlations of gender and other attributes in screen sci-fi. And again, I don't have time to go into all of them. Please see the study. But let's start with gender and embodiment so I can get you used to what this visual means. Embodiment happens in all sorts of ways across sci-fi. That body could be indistinguishable from human, like we see in Westworld, anthropomorphic, like C-3PO in Star Wars, or like an animal, or in an architecture, or in a device, or a PC, or in a vehicle. All sorts of ways. Now, there's a lot of noise in that chart that you can see above, but the good news is if you see that gray bar through the middle, that means the statistical bounds where we would expect variation in the real world data. And we only want to look at the data, the bars that poke out of that bar. And when we do that, you can see that when the AI is in a body that is indistinguishable from a human, it's more likely to be female. And when it is anthropomorphic, it's much more likely to be male. And the other ones, zoomorphic, it's going to be other, kind of course, which gives us one takeaway that's disturbing, which is to say, in screen-based sci-fi AI, male is machines and female is bodies, which is kind of a male-gazy trope, and I'm looking at you, Hollywood. But let's get to the gender and subservience, which was the main focus of the study. And the bad news is, when we took a look at the data, it doesn't support the claim that women AI are more subservient. All of the female bars are well within the statistical gray bar that you see there, a variance that we would expect to see. We do see that males are actually overrepresented when it comes to free-willed AI, but only other genders are represented when they are improvisationally subservient to some other entity. That does tell us that it's a little disturbing that male holds the award for being free-willed AI and machine is subservience. But that's not the one that really got me most angry, and that one I want to share with you. And that is this, gender and germaneness. When I tagged germaneness for characters, I took a look at how important gender was to the story. Could you swap out the gender presentation of one of the AIs and have it change the plot? And for most of the time, the answer was no. I think it's about 77% of the time. If a character's gender could be changed and you just needed to say to change the sexuality of another character, I tagged as slightly germane because that doesn't really affect the plot much at all. It's just the relationships of the characters. Of course it matters, but in this case it's only slightly relevant to the plot. And then there was only one story, in fact, where it was highly relevant, but I don't have time to get into that. Genuinely, though, what we see here is that in AI, when the gender doesn't matter, Hollywood defaults to male, and only when it's necessary does it default to female. And that is infuriating. I hope you're infuriated with me, right? Screen sci-fi is just made up. There's no reason it should be skewed that way. It doesn't need to have a gender or a particular gender, or even like a stable gender. It might produce new genders that we haven't thought about yet. And it matters, right? This is a quote from Whoopi Goldberg where she saw Uhura on screen for the first time in Star Trek. She called out to her mom and said, hey, there's a black lady on television and she ain't no maid. Representation, it matters. even in technology, and even in fake technology that we see in sci-fi. And as we are all beginning to design more and more for AI and its personification, please keep all of this in mind and design wisely. I'm actually over time now. Thank you. I'm going to stop. But if you want to see the raw data, you can see it at this URL here. Or if you want to see the full results, head to the blog at sci-fi-interfaces.com and search for gendered AI, where you can read all of it. Thank you for your time. Have a great conference.